Welcome to the Wine Yogi. I'm your guide, Crystal, and I'm here to help you navigate your way through the wonderful world of wine and all its heady associates, craft beers, spirits, and gourmet foods, with the knowledge of a sommelier, the sometimes calm patience of a yoga instructor, and of course the wacky humor of a former Air Force pilot, stay-at-home mama, and a girl raised in the South. So let's get chatting about wine. Welcome to this episode of the Wine Yogi. Today we're going to be focusing on one of my all-time favorite wine history stories, and it is in honor of our Independence Day. So if you are listening to this podcast on the day it comes out, it's going to be coming out on July the 3rd, the day before 4th of July, Independence Day. Just one of my, as a patriot, as someone who loves the nation I was blessed enough to be born in, I love this story about wine and the role that it played in the founding of our nation, that we are all so fortunate to find ourselves in today. If I actually have somebody that's not an American listening to this podcast, props to you wherever you're at. This is going to be very much a red, white, and blue presentation on the influence that wine has had on American history, and specifically the revolution that led to our nation's independence. So let's begin first of all, by discussing the colonization of the New World from the Old World. So New World, Old World. Oh, see, look, there's already a wine tie. But so we are, looking at all of these explorers that were crossing the Atlantic Ocean, coming to this wonderful new paradise where grapes are just hanging by the bunches. The grapes are ginormous. Boy, think of the wine we're going to make with those Concord grapes. Not quite. Muscadine. I mean, it makes wine. Foxy wine. But not the wine that the Old World was necessarily accustomed to. But you have to remember, at the time, they were mostly sailing across the Atlantic in warm summer months, because if you have seen Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, we know what happens when you sail the Atlantic in cold months. And that was April, and it was pretty freaking cold when the Titanic hit that iceberg. So in order to avoid those icebergs and to sail when it was a little bit more palatable and not as rough, most of the voyages took place in the summer. Now, were a couple of stopping off points as they would cross the Atlantic. So if you're familiar with island chains such as the Azores, when you're getting into places like Madeira, these were all kind of the final, we're going to hit this place before we set sail for far shores in the New World. So those places became very important to the sailors as they were getting ready to embark and leave Portugal or Spain or wherever behind, but especially when you look at the island of Madeira, which is part of Portugal, that was one of the places that they stopped off on their way. And that's when you have the most wonderful discovery take place of Madeira. And that is one of the wines that I would like to discuss on today's podcast, as we're looking a little bit into the history of wine, the American colonies, and the Revolution. So Madeira is a small little island due west of Morocco. So you kind of think, where Morocco is, and sail west. And so slightly warmer than what you would get in terms of the equator location than Portugal, Spain, and that's pretty freaking warm already. But still, you're moving across. The grapes that grow there tend to have a lot of residual sugar because of this warm climate, and of course the Atlantic influence, so that maritime influence. But what they realized, they were putting these wines, these red wines, onto the ships in these casks, and there was not a lot of place underneath the deck to store them. So they were putting them up on top of the deck thinking, well, we're going to be drinking it as we go across. And, who knows? We're not going to have wine there when we get there. So we're going to drink it whether it's good or not. Because when, the choice is to drink the local water that may kill you or the wine that it may taste not so good, but it's not going to kill you, I would probably opt for option B in my case. But, if you would rather go with the water that may or may not kill you, you don't know. Anyway, but historically, that's why so many human beings around the world, regardless of where you were living, whether it was Europe, Asia, Africa, so many human beings have consumed some type of fermented fill in the blank. Grain, vegetable, fruit, simply because the water would kill you, or at least make you woefully sick, and nobody wants that. So back to Madeira. So you had a lot of Portuguese explorers hitting the New World. If you are familiar at all with how the New World was discovered, with Columbus being paid by the Spanish crown because the Italians didn't want to pay him, the English weren't going to pay him, but by golly, the Spaniards were all about conquering new lands. So as he went off and discovered the New World, thinking he'd made his way to India and the Indies, one of the discoveries that they made, particularly these Portuguese explorers that followed Columbus, was that the wine that they had put on in port at Madeira did not taste the same when they got to the New World. Now, why is that? As I said, not a lot of room on those ships. Down in the holds, you had animals, you had sleeping quarters for the crew, and sadly, in some cases, if they were slave traders, you had human beings that were being forced, later on, going over to the New World. So lots of different things were beneath the hulls. The wine was not one of them. And in fact, a lot of your food products themselves were not going to be down in the holds. Just not enough room. And you also don't want sailors having easy access to the alcohol. So you're out of sight, out of mind. And if you're the captain, personally, I would be putting all my alcohol up where I can see it, at least whoever is on the watch. So this wine sat in casks out in the sun, getting rocked and rolled with the ocean as they were sailing across, probably getting pummeled with the occasional salty wave or storm. Certainly all of this is happening, but the key thing that happened was the heat and the agitation. And what they discovered is when this Madeira wine, which was okay when they, put it on board, I'm sure at that time it was, sailors, if that was the life you had chosen, probably didn't have necessarily the refined palate of a master sommelier. But so the wine was probably passable. Not anything you'd write home about. But these sailors realized that when they got to the New World, this wine had changed. So one of the things that had happened is, in order to prevent this wine from turning into vinegar, and then at that point really not being able to consume it, they had added some neutral grape spirits. So they essentially fortified a still wine before it left port, just to make sure that the alcohol content prevented any spoilage from happening. And when they got there, what had happened was this motion and the heat cooked the wine, turning it into the most amazing fortified wine. And because of this transformation ended up being an extremely positive result, it became a very popular wine for those that were crossing the Atlantic during this exploratory period. Now, around this time, you have a lot of intrigue going on. So when you're in the 1500s, where you have a lot of this exploration happening, you have a Portuguese princess who ends up marrying one of the English kings that was completely broke. It was one of the Charleses. I don't recall which Charles. Not the current Charles, though, although he might be old enough. No, I'm just kidding. But she had married the English crown. Part of her prenup is that the wineries that she owned on the Madeira Islands were not to be taxed by the English crown. So, interestingly enough, you know, the English are all about their laws, and especially when it comes to taxation laws. Flash forward to 18th century colonial America, and you have Madeira coming in from the islands of Madeira being brought in by importers such as John Hancock. If you're familiar with who John Hancock is, there's a reason why his signature was so big on the Declaration of Independence. So you had a lot of the colonies bringing in Madeira wine, because it would last, it would make it, and it wouldn't be skunked or yucky because it had been cooked on these decks of the ships crossing the Atlantic. And there, honestly, no matter what they tried, the realization soon sank in that all those big, beautiful Concord grapes, muscadine grapes, while they look amazing on the vine, they do not produce the best wine. Northern American grapes, if you've ever heard me discuss about the native varietals that we have here in the United States, especially, they put off it's a foxy smell and taste, and they tend to be very, very sweet, and not sweet in the fortified wine sense. They have that cloying residual sweet aftertaste, which is preferred by a lot of folks. So I'm not judging on that. But for at the time, you have colonial colonists, you have these colonials that have had European wine. They have had old world fine wine. And so the expectation was, we want to have something on par with that. Well, enter in Madeira, which as a fortified wine was perfect to keep you warm and cold winter nights. And it came with the added benefit of the fact that the English crown could not tax it. And because that no taxation without representation was, you know, obviously the greatest bumper sticker ever coined by a political movement, they often chose the patriots, the colonists that wanted to separate from England, would choose Madeira as their drink of choice when they would enter into their local drinking establishment or tavern. On the flip side, if you were loyal to the crown and you were a Tory, one way that you could indicate that was to order a claret, which is what the English refer to as Bordeaux-style red wines coming out of France. Those were pretty limited, however, in this point in the colonies. So you're still looking at fortified wines. So in this case, port or sherry, something that was coming from other places where the English crown could actually tax, but also probably more into ales and things like that. So the craft beers and those type of spirits that could be transported with a little bit more ease weren't as delicate as your finer wines. But if you ordered Madeira, you were pretty much saying, hey, I'm a patriot. If you ordered other things or abstained from adult beverages, then you may have been either just saying, I'm neutral. Or if you were ordering particular things that were associated with the English crown, you were kind of waving your Union Jack flag to anyone in the tavern. Now, I mentioned John Hancock, and it is a pretty significant role that Madeira played in the actual first steps of the revolution. John Hancock had a sloop. He had a number of ships, but in one in particular was named the Liberty. And in the Boston harbor, this is before the Boston Tea Party, it was his ship was seized with several pipes of Madeira. So pipes are what they call those really long casks that they used to cook the Madeira in. And his cargo ship was seized, and by order of the the English government at the time, he was expected to pay taxes. However, being a well-educated man, knew that by law he could not be taxed on that Madeira, thanks to that prenup a few hundred years back. But again, this it's not like they had cell phones. They could just call up old King George and say, "Hey, dude, what's up? You can't tax me. All right, I'm going to file suit because you can't hold my ship." So before the Boston Tea Party ever took place and they dumped tea into the Boston Harbor, they snuck on board the sloop, the Liberty, and dumped Madeira into the Boston Harbor. So it was a preferred drink. It was seen as kind of that big middle finger to King George, to put it bluntly and in our modern terms. But it was seen as kind of a, we're going to show you drink of choice. It was beloved by Thomas Jefferson, absolutely loved it. And it was after the Declaration of Independence was signed, Madeira is what was used to toast for all of the delegates that it took part in toasting. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, these are some of the most notable founding fathers that have been known to appreciate and enjoy Madeira. It is said that at the inaugurations of George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, that they each had Madeira served at their inauguration. So it was very, very important to the early establishment, not only for our founding fathers themselves as a means of conveying their political dissent to King George. It became kind of that rallying cry and a way to snub their noses at the crown by drinking something that the English knew they could not tax without actually disregarding the law. So Madeira later on had its heyday in American history in that early 19th century, just after both the Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812. But then it began to subside it kind of coincided with a lot of things happening culturally where drinking was not as encouraged. Meanwhile, the same thing over in Europe that was sweeping across Europe was really reducing wine production at that point, and that was an epidemic of a little bug that came from New World grapes called Phylloxera that was wiping out Old World wine production. And so you saw a dramatic drop in the wine actually available for purchase in the New World, and because of that, prices went up, and you have a lot of things happening in the middle of the 19th century, such as the Civil War, that were certainly impacting the consumption of spirits and wine and things like that. But that's going a little bit too far forward in our American history. We're focusing primarily on that revolutionary period and why this particular wine was so important in our country's history. So why did the English think that they, by law, could seize that ship? Well, again, you had in the 1600s, late 1600s, early 1700s, they kept passing more and more laws restricting the importation of goods into the British colonies, into the colonies of America that were from Europe. Because they were trying to put a stranglehold on the French influence, a stranglehold on the Spanish and Portuguese influence into what they perceived as their colonies, the English colonies. So that one caveat in that prenup enabled, however, men such as John Hancock and his uncle, who is the one who really established this importing industry, this empire that Hancock ended up inheriting and then spent completely on the revolutionary effort. But you had plenty of people that were making a lot of money stopping in Madeira and bringing these wines over to American colonist tables. It was affordable, and it was, as I said, at that time, up until about the Civil War, it was the preferred wine of most American citizens. It is said that after the United States separated from England, nearly 1/4 of all Madeira was exported to the newly formed United States of America. So that relationship, it had a really solid run. And I'm thankful now that we're seeing a return to Madeira, because unfortunately Madeira kind of got a bad rap for a while there. And there's a couple of styles of Madeira that are only available in the United States. They are completely illegal elsewhere. I personally think they should be illegal here, but that's neither here nor there. And that's where they actually add water into the Madeira itself. And it's called rainwater style Madeira. But it is an interesting wine in that even though it can be sweet, it can also present as dry, but both are excellent food wines. And what it pairs, the styles of Madeira just really pair nicely with several different styles of meal, even the sweetest ones, the Malmsey, which is the sweetest of the Madeiras out there. So I'm going to briefly just discuss a couple of the 4 styles of Madeira, not rainwater, because it's available here. It is a cooking Madeira. I wouldn't use it. If I'm going to cook with Madeira, I'm going to cook with real Madeira, not watered down Madeira. So your 4 styles of Madeira, you have Surcial. So Surcial is going to be your dry Madeira. It's going to be very, very tart, a lot of acidity. So you have to think about when you're pairing that, what needs that pop of acidity, that tartness. So if you might be looking at things like certain seafood dishes, things that maybe have white cheese associated, maybe an Alfredo style sauce, or even looking honestly at some of my favorite foods, potatoes. So that Surcial would be quite lovely with kind of your starchy foods. Verdejo is a semi-sec, I would say it's more on the semi-sec side of things, which means it airs more towards the dry side, but you're starting to see a little bit of residual sugar. It is often golden in color, so kind of think of like that color of oak Chardonnay. It definitely is fuller, richer body because of that residual sugar that you're starting to see come out, and that balances the acidity. This is where you're going to start getting into those foods that would pair nicely with this would be, I think, anything with corn, especially things like cornbread. And so personally, because if I'm talking about the Independence Day celebrations, I'm thinking corn dogs. This would be great with corn dogs. I know you're like, what? It would be awesome with corn dogs because of the cornbread that's wrapped around the hot dog. But certainly if you are doing like cornbread with potato salad and baked beans and whatever protein, grilled chicken, whatever it is, this would be a really nice pairing with that. Now, my favorite of all the Madeiras out there is Bual. So it is sweeter and even richer than your Verdejo, but it is absolutely delightful. It's not too overly sweet. It's not as heavy as, say, a tawny port. And it has just enough of the acidity still there that it causes the mouth to water. And so you don't have that kind of cloying sweetness remaining. Now, this one, if I were to pair it up, it would be along the lines of, I like to actually, when I make cornbread, I like to add in jalapeno and some cheese, and I like it sweet. So this Bual would pair so nicely with spicier things because of that sweeter finish. So if you're doing spicy rib sauce, if you're grilling some ribs or something for the 4th of July, or you have any type of barbecue or brisket where you're putting on some heat on something, this may be your go-to. And then it would easily transition into if you're doing like s'mores or any of your desserts and pies and things like that. This with apple pie, oh my God. Shut your mama's mouth right there. That's so money. Be so good. And it's indescribable and so affordable. All of these are extremely reasonably priced. Finally, if you have a sweet tooth and you want to enjoy your dessert in more of the liquid form, may I suggest a Madeira called Malmsey. It is very, very sweet. It has, it's made from Malvasia grapes that would be described as super ripe. I would call them rotten. So they've had a chance to develop some of that noble rotten botrytis. So that's why the sugar content is so high. But yeah, there's so many different styles depending on your palate and your taste. Just remember, these are fortified wines. That means their alcohol content by volume is going to be higher than your normal, regular, run-of-the-mill wine from France, Germany, Italy, etc. So they're not meant to be drunk by that standard wine glass size. These are meant to be consumed in smaller glasses. It's to sip, it's not to chug, it's to really kind of savor and enjoy. So you'll definitely probably want to have something else if you're serving this with dinner. I'm going to be toasting with it at the 4th of July to celebrate my nation's birth. But if you are looking for any specific types of brands, I tend to lean towards Broadbent or Blandy, Blandy, Blandies, and Broadbent. So very English sounding names. So there is a huge English influence, and they weren't, it wasn't just those pesky revolutionaries like John Hancock hauling everything in. But you'll see quite an influence, just like you will in port. You'll see a heavy influence of English names, and that's because these are the families that have been producing and exporting these particular fortified wines. So I like Broadbent and Blandies. There are plenty of other ones out there that you can find. You will probably spend anywhere between 25 to 50 and upwards, depending on whether it's vintage, depending on the style and where you're buying it, quite honestly. Madeira is difficult to find. It is not as well known as, say, sherry or port in terms of the fortified wines. But talk to your wine store, your local wine shop, see if they can get you in. I think Bual is a great approachable first attack at Madeira. And then be sure to enjoy it on your 4th of July. And know that you are reconnecting with the Founding Fathers, celebrating the birth of our nation, and maybe even just kind of, take a moment and read the Declaration of Independence while you're sipping on your Madeira. I'm telling you, for me, because I love Thomas Jefferson, Mandy and I, we rotate who is president of the Thomas Jefferson Fan Club. But it's for me, and if you know my history, I served in the Air Force for 20 years, and I was, raised by a Vietnam vet and come from a family of military. It is just such a special moment to connect. When I read the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July, I enjoy some Madeira. I actually like mine slightly chilled, and that's mainly just because on a hot summer night, I like things a little chilled, and I just think it kind of gives it a little extra pop. I think the acidity is it's not buried underneath the alcohol, which it can be as it warms up. So I like mine slightly chilled. I'm not talking like ice cold. I mean, like literally 58 degrees. That's all you need. So maybe put it in the fridge for 30 minutes and then bring it out and enjoy it. But maybe if you are willing and want to explore a new type of wine, if you're not super familiar with the fortifieds out there, this might be the one to go to. It has that special connection with our nation's history. It is certainly not a proper claret. That's a Bonnie Doon joke. They make a proper claret. It's actually pretty good. Bordeaux style wine made in California. But it is not what the English would have drunk over 200 years ago, 200 plus years ago, when they were ruling this beautiful, beautiful country that we now call home. So that's going to wrap things up. Until next time, happy 4th of July. Please keep in mind that this can be a difficult time for your veteran neighbors. The sounds of the fireworks and the celebrations not only can be upsetting to your pets, but also to veterans who may be dealing with some things. So if you have a neighbor that you know is a vet, maybe check in on them, make sure they're doing okay this 4th of July. You can certainly probably invite them over and share some Madeira, tell them the story. You'll seem fancy. You'll win at bar trivia. But more importantly, you will be connecting with your nation's history through an amazing wine. So until next time, cheers and namaste. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Wine Yogi. Please be sure to check out IamTheWineYogi.com for any updates to my schedule, current yoga classes that I'm offering online, and of course, wine tastings. Also, please be sure to subscribe to this podcast so that you can get updated on all the latest and greatest Wine Yogi podcasts. Until next time, cheers and namaste.